I guess this could be kind of boring. Unless you're like me, that is. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 38 years. I love to share information with you, but I also think it's good to share how I use certain tools because I think it would be great if you knew how to do it yourself. You don't need me to look up things, but maybe sometimes it's good to watch somebody else do it so you can figure out how you might do it. And today I wanted to look at a site that we've talked quite a bit about in my videos, Clinicaltrialsgov, and how I tend to use it so that I know what's going on with MS research at the present time. It's important to know when you see videos or you read articles about new and possible treatments or perhaps even cures for MS. Is anyone actually doing research on that? Because if they're not, it's all just talk. And clinicaltrials.gov is the site to go to for international research that's going on. Clinical trials are an important part of research that leads to treatments and cures that are approved for doctors to use when they're treating MS. And so if clinical trials does not have any record of some research being done towards that end, then you can't say that the miracle cure or the wonderful treatment or whatever is anything more than just wishful thinking. So why don't we take a look together at clinicaltrials.gov and how I might use it to find out what's really going on in the world of MS research. So here we are out on the clinicaltrials.gov website. I'll put the link down below, but it's a really easy URL to remember. And this is the introductory page where they tell you can search for a study. And all fields are optional, which is kind of nice. So you have a choice right away between recruiting and not recruiting studies or all studies. And I'm just going to leave it set to all studies because that's going to include studies that have completed and there are results available. The condition or disease you can fill in. And for now, we're just going to say multiple sclerosis because that's mainly what we're interested in. And other terms we'll come back to later. Because right now what we're looking at is just, is there a lot of research being done on multiple sclerosis? And as far as the country goes, I'm also going to leave that blank because I want to know what's going on all over the world, not just in my own country. I'm not so much interested here in finding a study that I could participate in as I am just knowing what's the research that's going on. So if I just do multiple sclerosis, all studies, and leave it wide open, what do I get as a search? So when I search on that, I get 2,823 studies found for multiple sclerosis. So what that tells you in a nutshell is that there's lots of research being done on multiple sclerosis or conditions that include multiple sclerosis. You have to realize that sometimes the studies are broader than just multiple sclerosis, but if the study description includes multiple sclerosis, it will show up in this list. Another thing we get a chance to do if we want to narrow our search results down, all this stuff down here on the left, we can search by not yet recruiting or recruiting, enrolled by invitation, active, not recruiting, suspended, terminated, completed, withdrawn, or unknown status. So if you really know what you're looking for, this can help narrow that down. And then there's other ways of looking at it too. We'll come back to this, but you can look at age groups. You can look at gender. You can look at study type or results or phase, and phase would mean whether you're in the phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. Phase 1 is usually just a safety trial, making sure that the proposed treatment or medicine or whatever they're doing does not cause harm, that is generally safe for people. If it clears phase 1, it goes on to phase 2, which is where it starts looking for efficacy, which is, does it actually work? Now, sometimes phase one is it safe in animals and all that. It'll start with animals and then it'll go to people. But safety is always more important than efficacy. A lot of studies are terminated when they realize it's just not safe enough. And they usually set the bar pretty high for what safety means. So that is a good thing. Anything that comes out of all these clinical trials is generally regarded as safe and could be trusted. That's not to say that you particularly may not have some kind of reaction to something, but in all of the folks that they've tested it on, they haven't seen that reaction to that extent. And then you can also search by funder type. So if you're looking for specific company, like a pharmaceutical company or a certain university, a certain medical institution, whatever, you can search by that. Again, it's usually more helpful to do that if you know what you're looking for. And then there's some study documents. You can also search by that. So there's lots of ways to go. If you look across the top here, you've got some ways of telling something about the study that you're looking at. The status is important because that tells you whether the study is completed, or as we scroll down here, they're still actively recruiting. Here they're active, but they're not recruiting, so they have enough participants. They're going ahead with it even though they are no longer recruiting. And that's kind of the three basic things you're going to see. These are the titles, and they're useful because what they do is, as you see, what I searched for was multiple sclerosis, and that is highlighted in all the titles. So you can see that multiple sclerosis is the thing that they're looking at. And again, it's reinforced over here under conditions. Multiple sclerosis is indeed what they are looking at. They're not looking more broadly. They're looking specifically at multiple sclerosis. Over here, this is an interesting column because this is telling you the interventions. What are they planning to test? So here we have venous angioplasty versus a sham angioplasty, and I can think of a few things less pleasant than to have a sham angioplasty. If we're going to have one, let's make it real. And it goes on. So you can look at the descriptions briefly to see if those are studies you want to know more about. And then finally over here, locations. These are the medical centers, the hospitals, the research centers where these tests are going on. So if you live near there and it's a study that's of interest to you, you now know who you might be able to contact. So that's just a real quick and dirty of the general studies that are available to look at if you just search for multiple sclerosis. But let's modify the search. Let's say that in addition to multiple sclerosis, I want to look at something specific. Oh, here I have even given myself some ideas. How about remyelination? We have heard that remyelination is the holy grail of multiple sclerosis, and we want to know what's really going on in this area. So let's go ahead and hit the search. And what do they say we have? They say we have 50 studies for remyelination. Let's check out what they're saying. Okay, so here's the first one. It's not even recruiting yet. That might be a good thing if you're wanting to get in on it, but under locations, they don't have anything listed. So you might have to click on the study itself to see what's really going on there. But they're looking at multiple sclerosis and inflammatory disease. The study title is Remyelination in Multiple Sclerosis, a PET-MR longitudinal study investigating individual profiles of myelin repair and the contribution of neuroinflammation. So longitudinal, I think what that really means is that they're looking at results of studies that have already been done. So they're not really going to be recruiting for people to participate. They're looking at tests that have already been done in a different kind of way, looking for something that perhaps those tests did not look for, but the data that came from those tests would be useful in figuring out whether their hypothesis has any merit. So that's kind of what's going on there. The third one is actually recruiting. Demyelination and remyelination in multiple sclerosis detected by brain amyloid PET-CT, so PET scans and CT scans. And this one you could actually, it's going on in Italy, and you could actually get involved in that if you wanted to because it's actively recruiting. So you can, even without clicking on any of these, you can learn something. Now here's one, number 4. Oh, immediately this catches my eye because this is from the Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon, which is only a couple hours from my house. And I have participated in a clinical trial with them before. This is telling you that it's completed and it has results. Might be interesting. Thyroid hormone for remyelination in multiple sclerosis, a safety and dose finding study. And the drug that they're testing over here, it says liothyronine sodium, and they're running it against a placebo to see what might happen. Well, let's go ahead and click on the results just so we can see what that might look like. See, in the box over here, it talks about the recruitment status. It's completed. It was first posted in May of 2016. So this study is not brand spanking new, right? Test results were first published back in 2018. And this study type was interventional. So in other words, some of the participants in the study actually had an intervention to see whether that intervention was beneficial or had no effect at all, or worst case was harmful. The study design was that it was randomized, which is good. And this is the details of the study and how it was conducted. So if you're interested in that, you can go through and look at that. And there's a lot of technical stuff that may or may not make any sense to you. They tell you that what the ratio of male to female participants in the study was, what the age range would be for the participants, the race, all the different demographic characteristics. And here's a lot more detail on that you can look through if you want. And the subtype of MS, they've got that in there. And various other parameters that would help you decide whether this test was even relevant to your situation. And they tell you what the outcome was that they were looking for. And there's secondary outcomes. There's adverse events. That's always important. Serious adverse events, mortality, other, limitations, caveats, more information, etc., etc. And there are publications that are indexed to this study. So this is the study probably. If you click on this, you then find an article that you can get for free through PubMed called Phase 1 Randomized Trial of Liothyronine for Remyelination in Multiple Sclerosis, a dose-ranging study with assessment of reliability of visual outcomes. And you can go ahead and you can read the results of this. But, for this video, that's not as much of what I'm interested in as I am interested in knowing, is there actually research being done in a specific subfield of MS? And just based on the number of search returns that we found in all stages of completion, I would say that yes, there is a lot of research being done on remyelination. Well, let's X that out and we'll find something else to search for. Now here is one that is useful for me because I'm an older adult. Now I want to limit my search results to show studies that were conducted on multiple sclerosis in older adults. I'm just curious right now what the kind of research is that they're interested in with older adults. And so for that, let's go ahead and do our search. There's 1,937 studies found for older adults with multiple sclerosis. And I won't go through all this. I think this would be something that would be interesting for you to do if this is something that you're wanting to know. How much is really being done specifically for older adults? And I think part of it too, you really do need to look into these individually if you're thinking that it might be relevant to you, because sometimes older adults is a relatively minor part of what they're looking at, and so you want to be absolutely sure. Now this one, for example, might have been a good one, the completed study on Free from Falls program in multiple sclerosis. And this was a behavioral educational intervention, so teaching people with multiple sclerosis to reduce their risk of falling. Very useful. Once again, it was at Oregon Health and Sciences University. Guess I could have been involved in that, but oh well, I guess I didn't know about it in time. Well, let's go back and check on something else. One thing that I really wanted to look at was something that Dr. Bieber had a video on not too long ago, and he was talking about where in the world there was MS, and perhaps why. And one of the things that's been kicked around is this idea of the vitamin D hypothesis, that vitamin D helps with reduction in the risk of getting MS and might even help you if you have MS not to progress. Let's go ahead and see what they have. How many studies do they have? Well, they got 49 studies for vitamin D and multiple sclerosis. And this name down here, this is the chemical name of vitamin D. So that's nice. Without my having to know the chemical name, they included that in the search terms. So even if the paper does not say vitamin D, but refers to the chemical name, I'm still going to get it on here. And as we look at this, okay, this is a safety trial, so this is an early phase trial, just to make sure that it's safe. And then this one is the role of vitamin D in reducing the relapse rate in patients with multiple sclerosis. That sounds pretty good. Where is that being conducted? Oh, I see this one is being done in Saudi Arabia. And again, we're just going to look through here. We see that there's a lot of things, a lot of research in all different places, looking at whether vitamin D3 is effective with multiple sclerosis. But let's make things a little bit more challenging. Instead of vitamin D, I want to look at something else, because Dr. Bieber's videos kind of dismissed the idea that vitamin D itself was the thing that was helpful to people with MS. He suggested that sunlight itself might be the thing that is good for people with multiple sclerosis, or people in general, because people who don't get as much sunlight exposure might be more likely to get multiple sclerosis than people who have lots of sun exposure.
From an epidemiologic perspective, the smoking gun, the thing that really clearly correlates with MS risk from a global perspective, is not Epstein-Barr virus. It may be certain aspects of diet or other aspects of westernization. These things are very correlated with each other. As people become wealthier, they spend less time outdoors and spend more time in the sun, and maybe even wear more clothing. But I think the clear smoking gun here is the sun, and it could very well be the case that the increasing prevalence of multiple sclerosis is due to less sun exposure. Of course, these other things, Epstein-Barr virus, diet, parasite exposure, wealth, they may all be factors, but I think the thing that seems to correlate the strongest, in my opinion, is the sun.
So let's go ahead and see if there's any research being done on that. Well, look at this, 20 studies for sunlight and multiple sclerosis. There's a completed one right here. Sunlight-mediated inter-organ leukocyte exchange, multiple sclerosis. Let's see. It's in Munster. It's from Munster in Germany. And it says it's completed. So that's interesting. I won't click on it, but that's something you could definitely look into and say, okay, so what were their results? And here also was a completed study out of Columbia University Medical Center in New York, Sunlight Study, online support groups for MS to address COVID-19. You know what? This is another thing to bear in mind, that just because they use a catchy acronym or a term does not mean it really is relevant to what you want. So you might want to check into this, but I'm kind of thinking they're not really looking at the thing I was thinking they were looking at. Well, let's just go right on down. We've got one here that I don't know if they're even recruiting yet, but they're using drugs, it looks like. So I don't know if sunshine has anything to do with it. And now we're going into another one. We're looking at depression in multiple sclerosis, and we're looking at theta burst stimulation. And that may have something to do with multiple sclerosis. I'd have to look into that a little bit more. Here's one that's recruiting: effects of dual task training in people with multiple sclerosis. And again, it doesn't really look like it's got a lot to do with sunshine because it's home exercise. I'm looking and looking here to see if I can find something that really talks about sunshine. See, now they're back to vitamin D here, and they're assuming that vitamin D and sunshine are 100% overlapping links, so that if you can detect any effectiveness of vitamin D, it would be essentially the same as saying sun exposure, which Dr. Bieber was saying is not the case. There's something else about sunshine that creates a resistance to multiple sclerosis, and it is not the vitamin D that's doing it. I'm just scrolling here, and I am not seeing what I was really hoping to see. So even though there were a lot of studies originally that said they were about sunshine, I'm not really seeing a lot about sunshine, am I? Well, let's just do, instead of sunlight, let's just do something else that's a little bit more specific. Maybe that's going to take us to something that's a little more germane to what we want. Sun exposure. What have they got? Okay, well, they do have a few studies. What do they say? 2. Okay, well, that's not a heck of a lot. But once again, if we scoot over to interventions on this one, it says dietary supplement vitamin D3. Well, that isn't necessarily sunshine. According to Dr. Bieber, that's not the same thing, so I'm not really sure what that's telling us. And then there's another one here that doesn't really look like it's particularly interested in sun exposure. So this is a good example of a time when a hypothesis is proposed. And I'm certainly not criticizing Dr. Bieber. I think he's right to tell us about it. But clinical trials does not seem to bear it out. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. That's entirely possible. But I could try looking at other search terms and other ways of coming at this. As you can see, it's a pretty robust search engine. So there's a possibility that I'm just missing something. But what I have demonstrated for you is how the results of Clinicaltrialsgov challenge what we hear about in the media or even from reputable sources. Just because an idea sounds very promising does not mean anybody's researching it. And if people aren't researching it, it's never going to make the big time because it will not be approved for use with patients. And that may not do us all that much good, to tell you the truth. Is it a good idea to get sun exposure? Yeah, I think it is. I don't see why it wouldn't be. But do we have any data that tells us that sun exposure helps us with multiple sclerosis, either in prevention or in keeping it from progressing? I don't see it here. So if you find something different, or if you've seen something different, if you know of a study that I didn't see here, I'd be interested to know, because if all I have to do is sit out in the sun for a little while and it will help my MS, I'd really be interested in doing that. But I'm not going to risk sunburn and skin cancer if it doesn't do any good anyway. Well, if you're still with me, I guess you weren't bored to death. And I hope that you did actually find this somewhat useful, and that perhaps you too can use it when people tell you about things that are supposed to be the next big thing. Find out if it's really getting tested, if there's really being research done on it. I'd be curious to know what you've been hearing and what kinds of things perhaps you'd like to know more about, because I like to do that kind of research. I like to find out what's going on, and I like to share what I find with all of you. So that's all I'm going to have for you today. I hope you really are enjoying your spring. The weather's finally getting nice. So take really good care of yourself until I see you again in my next video.